I want to turn our attention to Psalm 51. There in the 51st Psalm, you'll find this third verse translated from Hebrew into English in the New Revised Standard Version this way. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. For a time as ours to share, I want to think on the thought, good guilt. Good guilt. Sometimes I wonder if pockets of would-be prophets and cadres of career clergy persons have become increasingly victimized by our thin, manufactured notions of favor and grace. Part of being a mature, human, and faithful disciple is slowing down long enough to inhale the rancidness of injuries we inflict on each other. Can anything good come from guilt? Good guilt is not an invitation to hyper attention to our defects, insecurities, and limitations. It's not merely an awful sensation that eats away at our minds and eventually leaves us emotionally hollow. No, good guilt exists as a mechanism to help us recognize when we've done harm to someone. Good guilt potentially functions as an internal corrective that makes us more responsive to the hells we create for other people. Good guilt functions as a compass for a way forward to a new sense of responsibility for how we are in relationship with one another and how we're in relationship with God. What we need in this world is some good guilt. As truth stands on the auction block, decency is relegated to the ditches, civility is nailed to the cross of white heteropatriarchal xenophobia. Public policy is nothing more than a late night, early morning Twitter exercise. And as hope walks on the tightrope of absurdity, we need some good guilt to lead us towards social healing and moral renewal. That's what our world needs. Our world needs some good guilt that guards against self-loathing, apathy, and chronic inhumanity. And in our text today, David shows us the need to learn to sit with the consequences of our culpability before we skip off to cheap grace and manufactured favor. David in this text is no longer taking shifts in his father's barnyard. He is now the seasoned monarch of the United Tribes of Israel. So that means David's sin is not simply a personal sin, but David's sin is political. If you go to 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, it gives canonical credence to Lord Acton's maxim that power tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. David has an intoxication with power that convinced him that he could play dice with people's lives. David thinks that he can control Uriah and Bathsheba, while David, who's this seasoned monarch, he's supposed to be out in the field, supposed to be out on the vineyard, working as a warrior, leading his nation to battle. But that's not where we find David. We find David taking Bathsheba, and maybe I should say it a little more tersely, we find David raping Bathsheba. Oh, what a danger it is for you to allow your position to possess you. This is my caution to all of us ministers, all of us as people who carry the banner of Christ, who carry the banner of God. We have to beware of the propensity to allow the appointing to cheapen the integrity of our anointing. No one carries the right to create or define realities for other people. And obviously, you know, I must say this, over the last year, we've seen American women courageously place patriarchy on trial for sexual assault and rape culture. Men from Hollywood to the Hill, corporate offices to cable news companies, inappropriately and in many cases criminally treated women's bodies as if they were commodities or objects. Sisters, mothers, wives, friends are neither safe in the streets nor the sanctuary, neither in Washington nor the workplace, neither the backstage nor the bank. Sexual assault is everywhere, and the danger is that there are too many men who are being silent. Here, David, this psalmist, he says, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Churches major in naming individual sins, but we suffer because we don't know how to name institutional sins. Many of us, we succumb to the temptation of traditionalizing hierarchies of holiness and sliding scales of sinfulness because we like to police other people's lives while we let our own gardens overgrow themselves. We talk about sins of sex, sins of conversation, sins of consumption, but we never talk about sins of systems and sins of structures. I know what Paul says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but that prophet out of be well says some people are more sinned against than they are sinning, which means if we're going to talk about the sin that's ever before us, we can't just talk about the slavery of sin. We also have to talk about the sin of slavery. We can't just police sins, but we have to talk about the sin of racially biased policing. We can't just talk about the sickness of sin. We have to talk about the sin of repealing health care for the sick. We can't just talk about the bondage of sin. We have to talk about the sin of mass incarceration. We can't just talk about the wages of sin, but we have to talk about the sin of poverty wages. We can't just talk about the sin of breaking the law. We have to also talk about the sinful laws like mandatory minimums, sentencing disparity, racist school funding formulas. We can't just talk about not having the fruit of the Spirit. We have to also talk about those black bodies hanging from southern trees like strange fruit. Our sin is ever before us. That's what David says. But as I look at this, it reminds me that the most popular phrase, the most popular definition for sin in the Hebrew is missing the mark. I'll never forget, I was watching the 2004 Olympics, and Matt Emmons, who was a rifle shooter, that final Sunday of the Olympics, he's only 8 points away from clinching the goal. And while he is there, he talks about his mood, how nervous he was because he was just 8 points away from clinching the goal. He approaches the line 50 yards away from the bullseye. He aims his rifle and he shoots. And Emmons, he hits the bullseye. He's excited because he has now clinched the goal in his mind, but he notices that his points have not changed. He's hit the bullseye, but his points have not changed. And that's because he hit the bullseye in the wrong lane. And that's what happens to many of us when we miss the mark. It's not because there's something inherently wrong with us, but we miss the mark because we're aiming at the wrong targets. And maybe our lives would be more fulfilling. Maybe our societies would be more equitable. Maybe our world would be better if we learn how to aim at the right target. That's what Benjamin Elijah Mays says, that sin is low aim, and our world is a victim of its own low aim. And so my word for us is that we have to learn how to reshift our aim. In fact, that's what church is about. Church is about coming in every Sunday, every week in order to get an aim adjustment. That we come to worship to get an aim adjustment. We fast and pray to get an aim adjustment. We commit and confess our sins because we need an aim adjustment. David admits that he misses the mark, but it's because he has the wrong aim. I love this text, child of God, because although David starts talking about his sin, David has another vision. David has another target. David has another aim, and he talks about the grace, the compassion, and the mercy of our God. If you read those first two verses, you'll see that David says that God, your loving kindness and your steadfast love are true. I love this about this text because David now shifts his aim from his own guilt and his own person, and he shifts it now. He decenters his privilege in order to realize that he is not all that he could be. He decenters his privilege. Oh, wouldn't our world be a little better if we were all able to decenter our privilege, our male privilege, our racial privilege, our gender privilege, our sexuality privilege, our world. If we're going to make it more just, if we're going to practice some good guilt, we have to decenter our privilege and focus not on ourselves, but focus on God and focus on the other. David shows us that although his sins are ever before him, he also is a beneficiary of grace. He's a beneficiary of mercy. And that's a good word for many of us in here today, to know that we live in a constant dance between guilt and grace. We live in a waltz of culpability and compassion. David says, my sins are ever before me, but David also carries the spiritual coding of something else, the power to grow and the power to change. And so when we shift our focus from our guilt and our privilege to the hesed of God, the steadfast love of God, and the rechem of God, the mercy, the compassion of God. Did you hear that? The hesed of God. It is such a large word that English can't even put it into one sentence. It is God's faithful, unrelenting, unconditional love for us. That really ought to excite us in here today, that God is seemingly pathologically in love with us. Even when it goes against God's best interest, God is still in love with us. We have God's hesed, but we also have God's rechem. That's the compassion of God. And I love in that Hebrew image, it is not simply about feeling someone's pain, but literally the word for compassion gives you the image of womb, which means when God has compassion on you, God carries you in God's womb. I love the maternal images that we have here of God, that when I feel depleted, God carries me in God's womb. When I feel as if my sins are bigger than my potential, God carries me in God's womb. I'm not a mother, but I thank God for my single mother. And I know that when I was in her womb, I didn't want for anything. I was protected because in the womb, she developed me. In the womb, she fed me. In the womb, she provided for me. And now, my brothers and sisters, you ought to be able to thank God that even with your sinful self and your culpable self, that God still carries you in her womb, that God still nurtures you and holds you in her womb. And this should give us new definition that we're not just born again, but we're born again and again and again. Oh, thank God that I'm not just born again, but I'm born again and again and again. Oh, my sins are ever before me. David doesn't just stop there, but he says, create in me a clean heart. And this is the only type of creation. This word bara is only a word that they use for God. Only God can create in you a clean heart. Only God can give you a spiritual and moral EKG to figure out where you're clogged and cluttered. Only God can give you a spiritual EKG that will transplant your heart. And maybe there's someone in here today that can say, I'm a beneficiary of God's cardiac surgery. I'm a beneficiary of God's engagement in my life. And I need us to know that when you have good guilt, it will lead you from pain into possibilities. When you have good guilt, it will move you from inaction into infinite possibilities. When you have good guilt, it will give you the power to see yourself and to see your world in ways that you've never seen it before. My God never fails. And I thank God that even when I fail, my God never fails. Even when I'm hurting, my God never fails. Even when I'm wrong, my God never fails. America should be glad that our God never fails. My sin is ever before me. God, create in me a clean heart. Create in me a clean heart. God never fails. Good guilt is what we need. I'll never forget. I'm done. I'll never forget. And my mind goes now to a story. I was in the hospital doing what pastors do, going to visit the sick, giving communion to those who could not make it to us on Sunday morning. I remember I'm in the elevator, and there's this tall sister with this long black dress, with this nice white coat on. I assume she's a doctor. She has a stethoscope around her neck. And so I speak to her, and I say, what do you do here? And she says, well, I'm a cardiologist specialist. I said, oh, you're a cardiologist. cardiologist? She says, no, I'm not a cardiologist. I'm a cardiologist specialist. And I say, well, what does a cardiologist specialist do? She says, well, let me just put it to you in layman's terms. I'm the one they call when the cardiologist fails. And I think deeply about that. I said, oh, you're a bad sister, aren't you? And she says, yeah, I'm pretty good. And she says, well, what do you do here? Because I had on a nice blue suit with some nice brown shoes. I had a perfectly tied bow tie like they taught me at Morehouse College. I had a nice pressed shirt on with my monogram on it because sometimes I forget my initials. And she says, what do you do? And I said, well, I don't work here. And she says, well, what do you do? I said, well, let me just say it this way. I work for the one they call when you fail, because we serve a God that never fails, and we need a clean heart. We need a right spirit. We need some good guilt. And when you have good guilt, our God never fails.